Croeso Gŵyl Haf, and welcome to Gŵyl Haf. Today with me I have the lovely Helen Vassallo, who is returning for her part 2, her second appearance at Gŵyl Festival. Helen Vassallo is a senior lecturer in French at the University of Edinburgh, and also the reason why she is here today, runs a blog called Translating Women, which promotes women in translation, mostly fiction. And yeah, thank you so much, Helen, for joining.
Oh, thank you for having me back, Caitlin. It's such a pleasure to be invited back and lovely to see you again.
If anyone, honestly, it was no-brainer. If anyone hasn't seen Helen's talk from last year, would definitely recommend watching it after you watch this one. It was brilliant. So just to sort of like introduce, I was wondering if you could recap for people who didn't see last year's talk, what your blog is, how it started, and that kind of thing.
Absolutely. I should probably first say that I work at the University of Exeter rather than Edinburgh.
Oh my God, that's so funny. I thought I was saying Exeter. I had Exeter in my head. I've been doing too much work with Edinburgh recently. I've got Edinburgh on the brain.
So it's fine. It's just they might get a bit concerned that I've moved without telling anybody. But anyway, it's fine.
I swear I knew it was Exeter. I thought I was saying it as I spoke. Yeah.
That's fine. I love Edinburgh. It's a beautiful place. So I don't mind being, momentarily transferred there.
I'll love you on the staff. Lovely.
Oh, thanks. That was a really easy interview as well. So you asked about the Translating Women project anyway, which is the big reason that you invited me to talk. So basically it responds to the gender imbalance in the publication of translated literature. So there are a couple of statistics. One is really widely known, which is that only about 3 to 5% of what gets published in English, of literature that gets published in English was originally in another language. And then within that really tiny percentage, somewhere between a quarter and a third is written by women. So the project tries to address that imbalance and seek ways of challenging it. But it didn't start off with that kind of awareness. It started for purely personal reasons of wanting to broaden my own reading rather than just reading in languages that I was proficient in. Because, I've always read mostly writing by women. But I realised that within that, I only really knew writing by women in English, in French, a little in Spanish, because, those are the languages that I speak. And it struck me that as someone who speaks more than one language, you always assume that you have this wider experience available to you. But I was still limiting myself to literature from a small proportion of the world. So now the project's much more about trying to promote women's writing in translation, but in a really targeted way that thinks about which publishers are doing good work in bringing those stories to an Anglophone audience and which translators are making a difference to the way that literature from the region they work from is perceived in Anglophone contexts.
Oh, it's it's such an admirable project, because I think we've talked a bit last year, and sort of you mentioned that, and then I've sort of run with that idea a little bit in other places, that there's sort of this prejudice that sort of reading in the original language is inherently better, and that's sort of taken without thought, especially in sort of language teaching, as sort of like a way to motivate kids to learn a language, and it just doesn't reflect that you will not be able to learn all the world's languages, but you can actually read something from the entire world.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have to dispel that notion that either a translated book is inferior to an original text, or that it's in some way harder than reading a book that was originally written in the language that you speak. So those are two biases that I think we just internalize growing up, that are just part of our perhaps unspoken education. Sometimes it might be articulated, but it's not always. Sometimes it's just one of those biases that we internalize because it exists. And it's really important to challenge those, to recognize them first of all, and then to challenge them, definitely.
And it doesn't apply, sorry, it doesn't apply to like Tolstoy. Nobody thinks about like Tolstoy as being translated, or like, sort of these classics that obviously also are translated. So I wanted to sort of follow up from last year. Last year we talked about a few favourite books and that you'd sort of read recently, and I wondered if you had a few favourite reads from this last year.
I do, yes. I've chosen 4 to talk about, and I've got them with me so that I can show the beautiful covers as well. So the first one I chose was Strange Beasts of China. So this is by Yenge and translated by Jeremy Chang, Tilted Axis Press. And I think it's my favourite Tilted Axis book of all time. And that's saying quite a lot because I love Tilted Axis. Are you going to agree with me there?
I completely agree. The only one that like comes close to it for me is Hamid Ismailov, The Devil's Dance, which you might have read because it's not a man, it's a man. But this one,
I have read it. Yeah, it's great.
But I agree, it's Strange Beast of China is so good.
I love it, and I loved that. One of the things I really loved actually is that it didn't strike me as something that would be, I hate this phrase, so I'm going to do scare quotes, my kind of thing. And I think it was really important for me to realise that I have these ideas about what my kind of book might be. And something this fantastical isn't something I would normally be drawn to. And this is one of the great things about having a subscription, I think, to these presses, because you don't choose what you get sent. You get sent, everything that you signed up for. And so I read this. I guess I was going to say with no expectations, but in a way with expectations that I wasn't going to love it. And, it was one of those things when either you realise that your preconceived ideas were rubbish or the book's just so amazing that it's able to smash through them. But whichever it was just a wonderful book. It's this story of humans and beasts coexisting pretty unharmoniously in a Chinese city. And they're kind of trying to live by ignoring the reality that sometimes the beasts are more human than the people and the human are more monstrous than the beasts. So there's lots going on. There's a mystery at the heart of it. It's a great story. The characters are just bursting with heart themselves, whether they're human or whether they're beasts. And, the translation by Jeremy Chang is just outstanding. I mean, I think it took me longer than it would have to read this because I just kept stopping to reread bits because, there would be a turn of phrase that was just so outstanding, or a sensitivity to register that made me want to go back and read the whole paragraph again. So that was really an outstanding publication for me last year. So that had to be my first choice for you. And my next choice is also by Tilted Axis, and it's Selma's Women Dreaming, translated by Meena Kandasamy. So this one's translated from Tamil. And I feel this should be mandatory reading, not just because it shows the reality of life for women who don't really have any autonomy, because I don't think books should necessarily be obliged to educate, but it's just such an exquisite story. It's about this community of women in a small Muslim village in Tamil Nadu, and the main character's husband takes a second wife. So she exercises her legal right to divorce him, but in doing so finds herself ostracised by the whole community. So the ex-husband is obviously outraged and unleashes this righteous wrath on her. So she's got to deal with that, along with her mother constantly badgering her about how worried she is for her future now she's made this terrible decision. And so she gets pressured into marrying again to regain her status, but in the process loses her children. And so it's just this really powerful story. And the translation by Meena Kandasamy, it's so different from Jeremy Chang's translation of Strange Beasts of China in that it's not afraid, I shouldn't say not afraid in comparison with Jeremy's, but it retains aspects that won't be familiar to Western readers. And it's, but not in a destabilizing way, although I don't think there's anything wrong with feeling destabilized when you read, but just in a sense that it's not made to be easily digested and packaged and here you are. I think it's meant to challenge and to take us there rather than to try and bring the characters to us and their situation to us. And so, again, I really appreciated not just the story, but also the translation. And I highly recommend that one as well. So choice number 3 is Daughters. I don't know if you know this one, by Lucy Fricker.
I know that. I read Paula.
Yes. So from V&Q Books as well. So they're a new imprint of a German publishing house. So they're publishing, as you'll know, German books originally written in German. They're publishing an English translation, and this one's translated by Sinead Crow. It's just this hilarious madcap road trip through Western Europe. So you've got 2 best friends, either side of 40, Martha and Betty, and they embark on this car journey to Switzerland to accompany Martha's dad to a euthanasia clinic. So he's decided that that's his final destination. Or so they think, because there's a detour along the way that reveals that he had a hidden agenda. They never make it to Switzerland, so there are reunions, there are losses, there's an accident, there's romantic intrigue, there's the reappearance of somebody who's been long presumed dead. And it's just it's fast-paced, it's eventful, it's just amazing storytelling. It switches almost effortlessly between grief and humor. I mean, I was like welling up and then cracking up, and it was so, I was going to say escapist, but I'm not actually sure that's the right word, because it's not like I went out of myself or anything. It was just fun, and also it moved me, and it brought out all of this range of emotions, and the translation kept pace with that energy. The translation itself was really energetic. So I loved that. And I think if anybody just wants to, laugh and cry and just have a rollicking read, that's the one. And the final one that I've chosen to talk to you about is something I've only just read. It's Shocked Earth by Saskia Goldschmidt, translated from Dutch by Antoinette Fawcett, and it's only just been released by Saraband Books. So it's the story of a farming family in the Netherlands and their family business and livelihood. Sorry, bits are falling out of my book. Crash on. So their livelihood is up it down, in fact. Their livelihood is threatened by earthquakes caused by gas extraction. And the government is refusing to recognise that the damage to the properties is caused by the gas extraction. They're insisting that it's poor maintenance. And so the livelihood and well-being of this farming community is coming under threat. But it's also the story of generations and their conflicts. We've got 3 generations of the family living on the farm. And we see the granddaughter, the youngest, wanting to step out and do things her own way, so to move into organic farming. So there's lots of very kind of relevant contemporary issues about ecology and about our world and our connection with the world and the land that we live on. But it's also just such a human story about the relationships, especially between the generations. And there was one scene that it was so beautiful and so tragic. It made me cry so much that my daughter, my 7-year-old daughter, got out of bed to check I was okay. So, for a book to move me that much, I'm not really a big weeper when I'm reading. So it was really quite something. And I won't say what it was that happened, because I always try not to give spoilers. But for a book to have that effect on me, it just had to be on my list. Gorgeous story, flawless translation. I loved it. So those are the 4 that have really stood out for me since I last talked to you.
Oh, I can't wait to buy the 3 that I don't own. Amazing. I bought The Eighth Life, and and I still haven't read it yet. I think I've found a bit that, like, my summer where I'd normally get through like a bigger book or 2 sort of didn't quite happen, but I'm very excited to. So like, yeah, I can't wait to buy them. And the Yang Ge as well, I've bought some of her other books because I like Strange Beasts so much. And White Horse is really, really good. It's this tiny little book that's amazing. I also bought the Chili Paste Bean Clan.
Chili Paste Clan, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if you've read that, but it looks really good.
I have. That's brilliant. It's translated by Nikki Harman, and it's fantastic as well. It's just such a fun story. But again, it's full of heart, and so I think you've got a treat waiting for you there.
Can't wait. So sort of as part of these conversations, we sort of talked last year a lot about intersectionality and how to be intersectional in our reading, and how that's, you're not a good feminist if you're not an intersectional, you're not a feminist if you're not intersectional. And I was wondering how your understanding of that has developed over the last year, and also maybe a little bit about, like, how has the blog been the last year?
Well, I'm certainly more than ever aware of the Eurocentric bias in translated literature. I see it in prize lists, I see it in the books that I get offered, I see it when I do analysis of my own reading, So I think it's not just a question of publishing more women, but also of thinking about where those women writers are coming from in terms of geopolitics, cultural background, social identity, and so on. So, I mean, it's been pretty well documented that women face greater obstacles to getting published in their source culture, and so they don't necessarily come as easily to the attention of English language publishers who are looking for new works to commission. So that lack of visibility is a massive barrier. But I think we also need to think about other kinds of invisibility, like, for women who don't come from a dominant world culture, who aren't white, who don't come from a middle class or affluent background, or who have some other social characteristic that intersects with gender to make the marginalisation or the lack of visibility more acute. I've also read some really interesting pieces about how even when we do seek out work from other cultures, it's often trapped in expectations of what it should be like and what it should represent. So I think it's not enough just to say, oh, we're doing really well because we've published this book from this country, but rather think about how that book's being marketed and presented, and why that one was chosen over another one, and what we could do to make sure that more literature from that region gets through. So I think intersectionality is still really key for me, and I think it will be always, because you mentioned there a comment that I'd made last year. We can't just think about gender without thinking about other forms of bias. So it's not enough just to play a numbers game and say, yeah, but look at all these women we've published, if they're all, white middle-class European women. We've got to think about other ways of making a range of voices heard. And I'm really conscious of that. You mentioned the blog, that sometimes I'll be writing a review and I'll think, this is the fourth French novel that I've reviewed this year, or, however many European ones I've done. And I think we're all guilty of that. So I can sit here and talk about the need to encourage that diversity and go beyond the just, well, I get what's offered to me. So I can sit here and say that it's important to do that, but I have to go out and actively seek it as well. And, particularly in this time when we've all been through various challenges in the past year, I think it is easier to just sit back and let things come to you. So it's not that I'm unsympathetic to that position of the publishers, because I think we're all guilty of it to an extent. But I do think we need to have a greater awareness of it. And we can't always blame the chain of what arrives at us. If we're not doing something to actively disrupt that chain, then I think we become complicit in the problem.
Absolutely. And it takes, I think I might have said this in another talk, the thing I've found is it takes work, and I don't know why you don't add, obviously I did expect it to, but it takes more than just Googling. For example, if you want to read books from an African country in particular, you might have, there's quite an access to Nigerian fiction, there's quite an access to Cote d'Ivoire, but actually that's sort of not enough. You can't just find those and sort of run with that. You have to put more research time and be prepared to put more of that time in to find books from other countries. And then you also have the problem of indigenous languages are not translated, and that all the languages that do come into translation are all colonial languages. I think that's always a sort of tension I feel, because it's so far I haven't found a way to really include indigenous languages, and that's something I really want to change and needs more work. Yeah,
absolutely. In terms of the regional diversity, I think one press that really does a lot of the legwork for us is Comma Press. I have such respect for the things that they publish, especially their Reading the City series. And I think that's a really great way into discovering literature from regions that we might know less about. And the way they work with editors who are embedded in the culture as well, I think is really important. So I think if people want to take away a little bit of the hard work of looking for books from those areas to read, then they could do worse than browse Comma Press's website.
You can also watch my talk with Becca Parkinson. That's a food press at the festival as well. Yeah, she was a delight to interview. She always is. Yeah, very much. So how how has the last year been? So we talked a little bit before we jumped on the call about how both of us had quite significant silver linings from the last year, and sort of in no way do I mean this as a negative question, but how has the last year impacted the type of books that you might read, and sort of how it's changed now, how reading might have changed? Because I'm always astounded how much you get through anyway, having children and having a full-time job. And that's something I think lots of people can relate to, struggling to fit reading into their lives. And like I said, I sort of haven't, normally over the summer is a time when I can read a bigger book, and I haven't had the chance to do that. And I've had much more reading of romance and sort of, you know, your beach reads, and like returning to some teenage books, a bit of fantasy. I just read the Shadow and Bone series and Six of Crows, and like have loved that. And I love those sorts of books. So yeah, I wonder if your reading has been altered at all by the year.
I suppose I should just say, because I don't want to feel like a fraud, that I work part-time at the moment, but that doesn't mean that I have loads of reading time, because in the days when I'm not working, I have, you know, the blog to run and a family to focus on. And at the moment, you know, I think in the last year, one of the big problems for me is that the balance of working hours has completely shifted, because obviously with having homeschooled for massive chunks of the past year, you know, everything's had to just sort of fit into the hours available. And that I find hard, because I quite like having clearly delineated times for working and for doing other things. So I think the situation of the last year has been quite logistically challenging, but I don't want to sound negative, because as you said, we were chatting about all the wonderful things that have come out of, you know, the challenges that we've been facing. So I won't kind of linger on the negatives, but I did read less than usual in 2020. I always have a look at the statistics of what I've read at the end of the year, and I read about 2/3 of what I would normally be reading since I started this project. And in some ways that was a shame, but what could I do when so much of the year was spent balancing all the different responsibilities that I had to, you know, to work, to homeschooling, to well, then balancing that with life as well, which goes on regardless of whatever else is happening. So in some ways it did make what I read more important, because I wanted to really enjoy what I read. You know, I didn't want to feel that I was wading through something that I was struggling with or not connecting with. But unfortunately, I did notice that I wasn't connecting as much with the books that I was reading. So, you know, I tend to only review books that I'm going to be very positive about, because I don't like to put a lot of criticism out and negativity out into the blogosphere. But I did struggle not to find positive things about the books, because I could sort of objectively step back and say, yeah, this is really good, this is really clever, but it wasn't necessarily something that I felt an emotional reaction to. And I can only assume that it's because my mind was stretched in so many directions, rather than because it was a less good than usual crop of books that was being released last year. So in terms of how it affected what I read, well, normally what I read is directed by what gets sent to me. So the difference or the impact it's had has been more in what I've chosen for my holiday time. So, you know, we spoke, as you mentioned last year, about The Eighth Life, which, you know, that 1,000-page novel that I decided to read just as I started, you know, becoming a homeschooling working person. And it seemed like madness at the time, but it just swept me away. And it was just this wonderful narrative, that exactly what I needed at that point. And I think that kind of sweep you away story has been what I've sought out when in the few choices that I've had about what I'm going to read for my downtime. That's really been key. So one thing I did was to reread something I loved. So there was a point last year when I was looking through the pile of books that I needed to read, and I just had this really visceral feeling that I wanted to reread The Adventures of China Iron by Gabriela Cabezón Camara. So that was published by Charco Press in 2019 and translated by Fiona McIntosh and Iona McIntyre. And I'd loved it in 2019. Oh, you're going to say something.
Who are also appearing at the festival.
Hooray!
They both did a fantastic event, and that will either have just come out or be coming out in a few days.
Brilliant. Oh, well, I will look forward to hearing them speak, because the translation is just fantastic. It's such a rich and multi-layered book, you know, that it plays with literary history, it plays with sexuality. It's also just a great story. I seem to keep coming back to that for books that I really like at the moment. And I think maybe that's part of the effects of the pandemic as well. Just I want to get involved in a story. So, you know, as I said, I'd first read it in 2019 when it was released. So I'd gone to the Edinburgh Literary Book Festival. It seems weird that I actually went to a different place 2 years ago. But I did. I went there and I heard Gabriella talk, and I read the book shortly after that and loved it the first time round. But also, you know, the second time round, it was not just like curling up with an old friend, which was just really comforting, but also I found so much more in it. And I think it's brilliant to have that opportunity to give a second read to books that we love, or even that we don't love, to find something different in them. So that's one thing that I did a little bit differently, was deliberately saying, you know, whatever else is on my list, I actually just want to go back to that one right now. And I also finally, in the same vein, I finally read My Brilliant Friend. Elena Ferrante, obviously translated by Anne Goldstein and published in the UK by Europa Editions. So I've been putting it off for years, because obviously Ferrante is so famous. I have this kind of really contrary reaction. Like, I've never read a Harry Potter book, you know, confession. So all of these really famous authors, I naturally gravitate towards people who might actually need my support more than to people who are already really successful. And I suppose also because working in Women in Translation, you know, a lot of the time when I say to people, oh, this is what I read or what I write about, oh, you must love Elena Ferrante. So I'd really put off reading her, but, you know, and it's not her fault that she's been so commercially successful. And actually reading My Brilliant Friend, I could see why. So again, it was very much tied to the pandemic experience, because I read the majority of it the evening that I'd had my first vaccine dose, and I was feeling sort of feverish, a bit shaky, and just kind of curled up in my reading spot with My Brilliant Friend, and that was really comforting. So that's another, I guess it's the same sort of thing, just finding something that, you know, I've mentioned comforting in both of those, in reference to both of those books. And I think I mentioned curling up as well in reference to both of them, because that's the mental image I have of just kind of hunkering down with this great story. So I think that's the major effect that the pandemic has had in the few sort of active choices that I've made that aren't necessarily for the blog. Then that's been what I've prioritised.
That makes so much sense to me. I think it is the wanting to be so fully involved in a story that you can guarantee from certain types of books. That's gorgeous. So how has the last year then interacted with, I'm always quite interested in how you know, sort of your blog Translating Women interacts with your academic life, and how has sort of the last year interacted with that as well. I know that you've been doing some research, and I was going to ask, you know, is it nothing to do with translating women, or is it something? And I happen to know it is something, which was like quite a nice surprise to learn. So I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about your research.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so it is about translating women, but from a very different angle. So I'm writing a book about gender and activism in the UK publishing industry. So I'm trying to develop a new model of approaching studies in translation, or studies of translated literature, by looking at how books get into our hands rather than how they're translated, and what we can do about the books that make it through, rather than necessarily responding to books that have already made it through. So there are 5 case studies of independent publishers and of translators who've worked with them, and they've all been really generous in allowing me to interview them. So they've talked to me about what the challenges are for women in translation, what they do to work against that, or what they see being done elsewhere that they think is working well and that, you know, could be identified as good practice, and also the risks that they're taking and why it's important to do that. So for that project, I'm not specifically analysing translated fiction. I'm looking more at the processes of how it comes through to us. So I guess a more agent-based approach rather than a text-based approach. But it does inform everything else that I'm doing. So it interacts with the kind of the work that I do on the blog, where I talk much more about books and about the content of the books. So everything's connected, but it's quite good to have those two different aspects really, and keep the two things connected but still in their own separate spaces.
That sounds incredible. Can you sort of say who the 5 presses are, or is that sort of, I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Sure, there is probably no surprise because they're 5 of my favourite presses. So they are And Other Stories. So obviously they did the Year of Publishing Women a few years ago, and they're brilliant with the range of things that they publish. And there's Charco Press, who I adore, as you know. And I don't think I've ever read a book from Charco Press that I haven't loved. So that's it's brilliant to be able to involve them. Comma Press as well. So I talked to Becca and also to Zoe and to Ra at Comma Press, and they've been really helpful and really inspiring. So at the moment, I've written my chapter on Comma Press and I'm 3,000 words over my own limit because there's just so much to say about the brilliant work they do. So I've got some serious editing to get on with. Then Fitzcarraldo Editions and Tilted Axis Press. So those are my 5 case studies. So yeah, 5 of my favourite publishers. So in that sense, it's a bit self-selecting, but also there's a reason why they're my favourites, because they're all in quite different ways, actually. They're all doing such brilliant things to make sure that diverse reading in translation is available to us. They have different agendas, they have different focuses, but they're all really admirable for the way that they're taking risks, which I think is something essential, but obviously potentially terrifying, and can often be seen as undesirable. Publishing is an industry that's very risk averse, and I think they're doing really radical things to make sure that there is a diversity of representation. And so I want to honour that in the work that I'm doing and focus on the great things they're doing, how we could do more of that, and basically the good practice that they're promoting. But then I'm trying to kind of bring a theoretical angle to that and show how those practices can help us develop a new model for approaching the way we see literature in translation. It sounds very grand. We'll see if I actually manage to get there. Writing hasn't been the easiest experience in the past year, I confess.
I can imagine. I can imagine. And sort of, I love that concept of looking at it through an agent-based approach, not least because I think it helps to sort of an average reader who might just not, as you sort of go about your life, as I do with like industries that I'm not involved in, you don't think necessarily about all the decisions that lead to somebody getting to a place. And so you can just forget that it is actually the reason you have a book in your hands is because people have decided to put that book in your hands. And so I love, do you have, obviously you are not finished with your book by any means, do you sort of have a sense of where some of the research has led you to that new model or a model that could be applicable to more publishers to sort of work on diversifying their language?
I haven't got full conclusions yet because I haven't finished writing it and I haven't finished all of my analysis. But certainly in terms of actively seeking out other stories, I think that's something that's key, because what they all have in common is that they don't wait for things to come to them, because I think they're all aware that by doing that, already they're limited to whatever has gone through several filters in its own country of origin in terms of publication, marketing, prize winning, agenting, and so they're actually putting out calls, and they're actively searching for innovative new writing. And I think that's going to be one of the key things that I'm going to try and integrate into a theoretical model. But I think I'll probably stop talking about it there, not because I'm being really suspenseful and trying to, but because I haven't actually got there yet with all my conclusions.
Absolutely, no, that's perfect. That is enough to go on already, I think. Like for a sort of like, you know, observer's point of view. I can't wait to read that book.
Oh, thank you.
That sounds incredible. Sort of a quote I haven't been able to stop using the last year is your quote from last year that was, a translator is probably the closest reader a text will ever have. And it's just seemed to be so applicable to so many different conversations I've had about translation, and to sort of reading in general, and to sort of like a lot of what translators say they like about translation is that they get to keep this close reading, and to sort of get to keep that in their practice, and that's something that they want from a job. And I sort of wondered how we could tie that to diversification, and like looking at those big publishers, and in particular calling on the big 5 UK publishers and US publishers to because that's a barrier in the industry, is that all these independent presses are doing incredible work, but that the vast majority of books that get published aren't from an independent press, and that the big 5 don't have the same priorities or the same outlook on sort of publishing and what they want to see, and make presumptions about readers and what readers will like, and you know, market in particular ways, sell particular books. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on what we can push, maybe not how, maybe that's a slightly too difficult question for us to answer here today, but how can we push what can we push those big publishers to be looking at more?
In some ways, I kind of don't want to say what the big publishers should be doing, because I feel that it's not really my place to pontificate on that. So I'd kind of rather focus on just, I suppose, generally what I'd like to see, positive practice that I've observed elsewhere. I think it's always important to listen to translators, and that's something that, in my experience, independent presses or smaller presses seem to do very well. I think translators can end up in a bit of a vicious circle, so they might want to champion particular work, but they also want to get commissioned. You know, they need to make a living. So I think often there's a lot of unpaid work that goes on behind the scenes to ensure that the projects they're passionate about make it to publication. You know, what I'd like to see from publishers, it's a tricky one, because what I'd want to say is more risk. Yeah. But I'm well aware that when your financial situation hangs in the balance, risk is not that appealing. And that's why I think the independents are so brave. So perhaps I'm implicitly answering your question more directly than I'd planned to. So I guess there are two things that I would like to see, that they might sound paradoxical actually, but well, I'll articulate them and then we can think about them. So firstly, I would like there not to be a box ticking exercise approach to commissioning translated literature. So some of the translators that I've interviewed have encountered publishers who might not want to publish the book they're pitching because they've already got one from a woman from that country, or they've got 2 from that language already, and so on. You know, as if 1 book or 2 books can represent an entire country or an entire culture. So I'd like to see, you know, greater representation. I'd like it not to be tokenistic, you know, so we've got this Japanese book, therefore we've done Japan. You know, I think it's really important to say, let's publish more and see how diverse literature within that country can be. But I'd also like to see, and this is probably what might sound paradoxical, I'd like to see greater diversity of representation in terms of which regions or literatures are represented. I think, you know, obviously there are some publishers that focus on specific regions, but within those regions, you know, you're talking about a massive part of the earth. So if Charco focus on Latin America, it's, you know, one of those countries is going to be massively diverse in its literature, and yet, you know, they're talking about all of them. They're publishing as diversely within that continent as possible, from within that continent as possible. Tilted Axis, a focus on Southeast Asia. Well, that's a big proportion of the globe. So I think there's this great model from the Independents about drawing attention to a particular region or a particular language. And I think that's a really good model to work towards. In general, I think I'd like to see a greater openness. So a recognition, and this is, you know, for readers as well, a recognition that we shouldn't expect translated literature to come packaged to us in a neatly digestible form. And I guess I was talking about that a little bit with some of the book recommendations I made earlier. I think, you know, we shouldn't be afraid to read literature that we don't relate to, or literature in which we don't see ourselves reflected. So, you know, I get really irritated when I read reviews that say, oh, I couldn't connect with this because they ate this thing for breakfast that I don't recognize, or, you know, I didn't understand why this celebration was important. I think we need to be comfortable with what we don't know, or with knowing that we don't know, because if we only read books that reflect ourselves and our existing views and kind of reflect those views back at us, then how will we ever know that we're not the only ones in the world, and that we might not always be right, you know? So I think it's really important to have that openness. There's a critic and writer, Madhu Kaza, who I'm using quite a lot in my research, and she describes translation as a hospitality that alters both the guest and the host. And I think that applies to the reader too. So it's not just about the process of translation or what goes on in the text itself, but I think that reading has the power to change us if we're open to that. I think it's good to read things in which we don't necessarily see ourselves reflected. I think that inspires empathy. And for me, empathy is important whether you're a reader, a translator, or a publisher. You know, I think, in fact, I think empathy for me is everything. It's the key to reading better. It's the key to understanding ourselves better. It's the key to living better. So I guess to conclude, more empathy.
And to get more empathy, you need to read more. That's the famous thing that people say comes from reading, is reading creates empathy. It's a beautiful circle to link all of that together. I also think sort of something that you, like something I thought about whilst you were just speaking, is that we need to learn from children. Children often, when they so obviously adults all filter children's books, which can be a problem in and of itself, and something that adults will sometimes do is say, oh well, a kid wouldn't be familiar with that, they wouldn't get it. And actually all the evidence is that kids will totally adapt. They don't mind at all. They really are not fazed by things if they don't know them. You can learn for context. You can, you know, a kid doesn't know lots of things anyway. So I think that, like, applying all of that to children's literature and to learning from actually how we sort of instinctively read and can learn.
Yeah. I agree with that. And I think it was really interesting when you said there are lots of things that kids don't know. There are lots of things that adults don't know. You know, there are far more things I don't know than things I do know. And I think we need to be comfortable with that. And, you know, not be comfortable in our ignorance, but be comfortable trying to always expand our knowledge, our awareness of the world, and however we do that, you know. And I think, you know, you're right when you say that reading is a really important way of doing that. But I think we need to be comfortable about that discomfort, whether it's a discomfort because we don't recognize something when we're reading a book, or whether it's a discomfort because our own flaws are made clear to us. You know, like I said with Strange Beasts of China, when I realized that I had an expectation that it wasn't going to be my kind of book, well, I was kind of a bit ashamed of myself for feeling that I had a kind of book, you know, because I consider myself to have that openness as a reader. And so I think we need to constantly be questioning ourselves, you know, not in a self-flagellating way, but just in a self-aware way. Because one of the things that I think is really important is that reading other people's stories helps us learn more about ourselves, or become more developed within ourselves, or just have that greater knowledge and experience. And I suppose, you know, to come back to the previous point, to foster that greater empathy, which I think is really key.
And thank you so much, Helen, for talking to me today, and not least for giving me a whole new set of quotes to carry me through the next year. I can already see empathy is everything. All around.
I'll get a t-shirt made for next year.
Thank you so much, and thank you for all the work that you do, and I really appreciate you taking the time. This was a fabulous talk.
Oh, thank you so much, Caitlin. Thank you for having me, and thank you for the thought-provoking questions and for organising the festival. I can't wait to see all the other sessions.
Me too. So thank you very much for watching. If you would like to see some of those other sessions, which by now I will know what they are, well, I know what they are, but they'll all be recorded. You can click down below and see the full programme in the description box. We also have a Patreon if you are able to donate anything, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival, and thank you very much for watching.